So, Fidel Castro. When you hear that name, you definitely picture the fatigues, the beard, right?
Absolutely. It's an iconic image.
But what was really behind his decision, to steer Cuba down that socialist path for, well, almost 50 years?
That's the core question, isn't it? And it's a really compelling story.
We want to look at what fueled that, what happened because of it, and maybe what we can take away from it all.
To really get it, you need to look a bit deeper than just the headlines. He wasn't actually from a poor family,
Mhm.
They owned land.
Right, that's interesting. So not your typical revolutionary origin story.
Not exactly.
Yeah.
But he was drawn to ideas challenging the status quo quite early on. Very critical of the U.S. influence in Cuba, the Caribbean generally.
And he got involved politically.
Yeah, he joined the Party of the Cuban People. They were
Yeah.
pushing for social justice, real changes.
So there was this kind of intellectual awakening happening, moving from just wanting fairness to something more specific.
Definitely. More leftist, you could say. I mean, way back in 47, he was involved in a plan to overthrow the government in the Dominican Republic.
Wow, really? That early?
Yeah, it failed. But it shows that early anti-imperialist, maybe, streak.
Yeah.
Wanting to shake things up.
And the situation in Cuba itself must have played a huge role.
Oh, for sure. The political violence, the corruption in the late 40s, that, plus reading Marx, it really seemed to convince him that radical change was needed.
A revolution.
A revolution of the working class, as he saw it. It's interesting, though, he said later, reflecting on that time, that his early Marxist ideas were still incipient, and his actions were more a spontaneous reaction based on Martian anti-imperialist ideas.
Martí being José Martí, the Cuban independence hero.
Exactly. So a blend of influences early on. National pride, anti-colonialism, democracy, and then Marxism layering in.
Then came Batista's coup in 1952. That must have been pivotal. He was even thinking of running for Congress.
Absolutely pivotal. Suddenly, that whole Democratic avenue just vanished. Batista moved right, got close to the U.S., cracked down on socialist groups.
And that just pushed Castro further.
It seems so. It intensified his resolve.
Yeah.
He formed the movement, started planning armed resistance, which led, of course, to the Moncada barracks attack in 53.
Which didn't succeed militarily, but...
But his trial, his "History will absolve me" speech that became iconic, a real rallying cry against Batista. He really cast himself as Martí's successor then.
And after prison exile, he ends up in the Sierra Maestra Mountains, leading the guerrilla war.
Right, that legendary period. And then finally, marching into Havana in 1959.
Initially, though, it wasn't immediately declared a socialist state, was it? There was a provisional president.
Correct. Manuel Yuchia was named president, but Castro, as prime minister, pretty quickly held the real power. There was talk of reforms, even elections initially.
But things shifted.
They shifted, yeah. Publicly, he was telling the press he wasn't a communist. But secretly, he was meeting with members of the Popular Socialist Party, the PSP, which was the established communist party in Cuba.
Okay, so playing it carefully at first.
Seems like it. And then came the first agrarian reform in May 59. That was a big one.
Limiting land ownership.
Yeah, limiting how much land anyone could own, banning foreign ownership. It even affected his own mother's property. That was a clear sign of the direction things were going.
And he had that quote around then, didn't he? Something about the revolution being a dictatorship?
Yes, the revolution is the dictatorship of the exploited against the exploiters. Powerful stuff. Really framing it as a class struggle, the working class taking power from the elite.
That must have caused some ripples, even within his own movement.
It did. President Urrutia started voicing concerns about the growing Marxist influence.
And how did Castro react?
Well, Castro briefly resigned as PM, which put pressure on Urrutia, who was then forced out, and a Marxist, Osvaldo Dorticos, became president.
So the consolidation was happening quite fast.
Very fast. Then you had Huber Matos, a key revolutionary figure, resigning in October 59, specifically because of the communist influence.
And he was arrested for that.
Arrested, yes. By Camilo Cienfuegos, another major figure. There were leaflets dropped over Havana by Diaz Lanz, another disillusioned figure. Castro held a huge rally calling for revolutionary tribunals. Things were getting tense.
And internationally, how was he positioning Cuba?
Well, his trip to the UN in 1960 was significant. Stayed in Harlem, met Khrushchev, gave this incredibly long speech slamming U.S. policies.
Setting the stage for confrontation.
Absolutely. And then, April 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion.
Sponsored by the U.S., and Cuba won.
Cuba won. And that victory was massive for Castro's popularity and arguably his confidence. His biographer Peter Bourne wrote something like, Castro felt he'd done what Cubans had only dreamed of, taken on the U.S. and won.
That must have emboldened him incredibly.
Almost certainly. After that, you see the merging of the different revolutionary groups into the ORI, then the PURSC basically creating a single party based somewhat on the Soviet model.
Consolidating power.
Exactly. And then the big declaration in December 61.
That's when he openly said it.
Yes. He publicly admitted he'd been a Marxist-Leninist for years. And in his second declaration of Havana, he didn't just say it for Cuba, he called for revolution across Latin America.
Wow, that's quite a statement to the world.
Huge. And the immediate consequence, Cuba got kicked out of the Organization of American States.
So declaring for socialism, aligning with the Soviets, what were the results?
Well, the relationship with the Soviet Union deepened dramatically. Soviet technicians came in. Castro's own son, Fidelito, went to Moscow for school. Castro got the Lenin Peace Prize.
But the U.S. relationship completely froze over. The embargo started.
Right. The U.S. trade embargo hit hard. And, well, sources also point to internal issues, maybe some inefficient management in the newly nationalized industries, low productivity.
Leading to economic problems.
Yes. By 1962, there were food shortages. Rationing had to be brought in. It wasn't an easy transition economically.
And then the missile crisis, October 62. The world holds its breath.
And Castro wasn't even at the negotiating table, was he? It was Kennedy and Khrushchev making the deal over his head, essentially.
He must have felt betrayed.
Reports say he felt deeply betrayed, yeah. That decisions about missiles on Cuban soil were made without him. He issued his own demands to the U.S. afterwards.
What were they?
End the embargo. U.S. out of Guantanamo Bay, stop supporting dissidents, stop violating airspace and waters.
Were any met?
No, not at that time.
Yet, despite maybe feeling let down by the Soviets in that instance and the economic reliance, he kept pushing his own revolutionary agenda.
He did. He continued supporting anti-imperialist groups globally, sometimes even when Moscow wasn't fully on board, like backing Che Guevara's Andean project, which didn't end well. Cuba became a hub for training revolutionaries.
So ideologically committed, even defiant.
Very much so. Even later, under Brezhnev, when the relationship with the USSR was maybe more strained, Castro asserted Cuba's independence in certain ways, refusing to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, for instance.
But that economic dependence on the Soviets just grew, didn't it?
Massively.
Yeah.
By the late 80s, Soviet aid was a huge chunk of Cuba's GDP, which also meant the economy didn't diversify much.
And then the floor drops out. The Soviet Union collapses in 1991.
Exactly. Triggering the special period in Cuba, a time of extreme economic hardship.
They had to make changes then, right? Some reforms.
They did. They had to. Legalizing farmers markets, allowing some small private businesses, even letting U.S. dollars circulate for a while.
But Castro himself remained ideologically firm.
Oh, absolutely. He gave the quote, "We do not have a smidgen of capitalism or neoliberalism. We're defending, to the last atom, socialist ideas, principles, and goals, even amidst those necessary changes."
That really shows the depth of his conviction. Did things improve later?
Things eased somewhat, especially in the 2000s, with allies like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela providing significant economic support.
So looking back at the whole arc, the quest, the struggles, the outcomes, what's a summary of his motivation? Why declare Cuba socialist?
It really seems like a combination of things, deeply rooted.
Right.
Long-held ideological conviction, definitely Marxist-Leninist, but also fused with this intense Cuban nationalism.
Wanting independence from the U.S.
Yes, breaking free from that historical U.S. dominance. And also genuinely wanting to tackle the huge social and economic inequalities that existed in Cuba.
And the struggles were immense.
Immense. The revolution itself, then navigating the Cold War right next door to the U.S., the decades-long embargo, the economic shock after the Soviets collapsed.
And the outcomes, what did it all lead to?
Well, Cuba became a one-party socialist state. There were definite advancements, particularly in healthcare and education. Even groups like Amnesty International noted that.
Right.
And Cuba certainly gained a much bigger profile on the world stage than you might expect for a small island nation, mainly through its anti-imperialist stance and international aid efforts.
But there are criticisms, too.
Oh, absolutely. Persistent criticisms regarding human rights, restrictions on political freedoms, and, of course, the economic limitations and hardships many Cubans faced. It's a really complex legacy.
It definitely leaves you thinking, considering Cuba's history, Castro's clear motivations, What does it tell us about a nation trying to carve out such a distinct ideological path, especially when it clashes with dominant global systems?
Mhm.
What lessons are there, maybe, about national sovereignty versus economic reality, or about pursuing collective goals versus ensuring individual freedoms? It's a
Yeah.
it's a story that raises some big questions, doesn't it? Questions that still feel relevant today.